Randy, thank you.
Yeah, sure. My pleasure.
Drinking this beer from Forbidden Root.
Are you really? Excellent. Which one?
Well, it is the Purple Pills.
Purple Pills. Yeah.
I also have the Saison here. That thought I'd save that for a little later.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Couldn't find any Five Rabbit around here.
Yeah, we're not in Ohio anymore. We were there for a while. We couldn't support the market. So
yeah, I remember having a few in the past. But
yeah, yeah, we had. It's just you get away from home, and it's hard to make enough to sell enough beer to make the money to pay a salesperson, and you don't have a salesperson, you sell less beer, and kind of typical story for a lot of smaller breweries. So trying to stick close to home. So, and now everything's crazy. So
yeah, I don't know how people compete with. There's a local shop here that just has craft beer, and there's like 330 different beers available, and of course 40% of them are IPAs, so it narrows it down a bit.
Well, that's about it's about half the market. So there you go. If you don't like IPAs, you got less choice. We can't sell a dark beer these days. I don't know what it is. Yeah. Nobody wants a dark beer. It's crazy. Except an imperial stout. People want those, but nothing in between. It's an IPA or an imperial stout. Oh, and they drink a lot of Pilsner too. But
yeah,
that's funny. They're drinking pills. I guess I feel like that's kind of having a revival, if you will. Kind of coming back to the pills. Everyone wants to get away from it for the longest time, and now they're kind of coming back.
Real, good Pilsner never goes out of style. That's the secret in the brewing industry. Maybe not a secret, but like what do brewers really like? Really good pills.
Yeah.
It's just not just because it's hard, but just because it's a thing of beauty. When it's good. So, there's internet beers and there's beers that you actually drink. That's part of the mismatch right now. There's so much hubbub around the really extreme beers, and those are the ones that get the big scores and everybody goes crazy, it's the world's best beer or whatever. But the amount that you can actually sell of those, people come into your pub, they'll have like a taster of one of those and check it in on Untapped, and then have an IPA and then have a couple pills. And that's kind of the pattern, so it's like just kind of crazy times. You just got to find your people as best you can and treat everybody good and make the best beers you can, make beers you like, make beers that you think your customer base is going to enjoy, and if they go for something, give them more of that, and but also try and not lose yourself either. So it's tricky.
So how are things with under COVID and all that, like at Five Rabbit? They distribute around their area there, or?
Well, we go through a distributor, and they don't have a lot of sales force outside of the center city. So we had a pretty good business coming from a taproom business. We were doing, dance nights and all kinds of stuff with a pretty heavily Latin audience, and that all stopped. Of course, we're open, but we're open like this much, and so we're kind of struggling. We're actually in the process of trying to reformulate and turn ourselves into more of a brew pub in the city rather than a production facility out in the city outside. So we're working on that. Forbidden Root, we're doing maybe 2/3 of our regular volume or so. We've got that one up in Columbus and Easton, and every week we're a little better, and we seem to be bringing in people and selling some beer, and the brewer up there is kicking ass. He's making some really great beers. And food's amazing. If you guys ever get up to Columbus, you should definitely check it out, because it's not your average brew pub. It's really especially, in terms of the variety of the beer and the quality and creativity of the food.
I am.
Whole different thing. So worth going up there if you got other business. And we have a lot of patio space there, so it's a big place. It's like 260 seats or something. It's twice the size of our Chicago location. So, even with COVID and outdoor and all those restrictions, we can still get a fair number of people in there feeling pretty safe. So, so that's all been, again, we're feeling pretty good. It's not, we're not making we might be breaking even. I don't know. We're kind of right on that cusp, but that's pretty good these days. So,
yeah. Yeah, I found several of their beers here at Jungle Gems close by.
Yeah. Yep.
This one's tasting pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's we wanted to make a Pilsner that was just a little different. And so we had the idea of working with some floral ingredients. We tried all kinds of things, and we had kudzu blossoms in there at one point, and we couldn't get those approved by TTB. Peach blossoms, same deal. So we ended up with an iris root, which is sort of the predominant. It's that kind of vague, weird, like fruity aroma kind of thing that's in there. And also a little bit of jasmine, which gives you just a hint of exotic floral. And then chamomile, which is just fun and fresh and lively. And, that was Pierre Celis's secret ingredient in his wit beer always.
Okay.
So it has a history in brewing. And but we didn't want to make it not a Pilsner, right? So it's like that delicate balance, because Pilsner is a certain style box, right? You got boundaries. And if you push it outside of there, if it's too hoppy or really too anything, it's not a Pilsner anymore. So we're trying to throttle that just to the point where it's like, yeah, it's a Pilsner. Oh, but wait, there's a little something else going on in there too.
Yeah, if I didn't know, hadn't read the can, and somebody just gave me the beer, I'd say it was a Pilsner. It's floral.
Yeah.
I don't know that I could identify. I certainly wouldn't identify iris root.
Yeah, well, those are not that familiar. That's an unfamiliar ingredient. It's used in a lot of liqueurs and things. It's a hugely important ingredient in fragrance. It's like it's $40,000 a kilo for the gunk that they extract out of the root.
Wow.
So it's a really valuable perfumery ingredient. It doesn't take much to make a beer, because it's pretty potent, and we don't use that processed.
This is just the iris.
It's just it's the German iris or Florentine iris, big purple and white iris. Very classic kind of perfumery ingredient.
I have some of those in my backyard. Can I dig up the roots?
If they're a German iris or a Florentine iris, yeah, you can actually. It's pretty cool stuff. But again, it's not really a culinary thing these days, because it's just used in liqueurs and then, of course, in fragrance and things like that. So. What's everybody been brewing?
Well, just got done. I guess the most recent thing I did was an English barley wine that a bunch of us brewed. They were putting into a barrel that we had brewed. A Russian Imperial was in the whiskey barrel, so we're taking that out, putting the barley wine in.
Nice.
So we're.
Cool. I love those projects like that.
Yeah. So we've done a number of barrel projects, and many of them have not turned out well.
Yeah, it's hit or miss with those. You can get some funky thing going on, and even Goose Island had that big debacle with Bourbon County Stout like 3 years ago or whenever that was. And they had some weird bug in there that got into the packages and turned them sour inside the bottles. So
we were ahead of our time, Rick.
I know. We did. It was like a KBS clone, and it soured.
Yeah.
And, some of us liked it.
I enjoyed it. It had like a Rodenbach-y sort of chocolate cherry added to the KBS, so I enjoyed it. Everyone else pretty much hated it across the board, but I enjoyed it.
So much of it's your expectations. If you're expecting one thing, you get something else. It's hard to love that.
Well, I had a bit of a Rodenbach infection a while back, and everything was tasting good to me, but kind of off. And so, I'm sort of partial to that. But that's been exercised, and no more Roselaire blend for me.
Yeah, I had 1 year where I had a beautiful house Brett thing kind of going spontaneously. It was really good Brett. It was really a nice Brett strain. I don't know where it came from, but it was just like 1 year of brewing, and then it was no more. So.
So you were asking about what we've made. I made a wheat wine.
Yeah.
And it's like, I've never heard of anybody making one, and I made one, and I used Kvike yeast in it, and that was 4 months ago, and it's pretty good. I mean, but it's has no real distinct character. I think I could have done something to add some character to it, but it's
It's a cyber attack. Next 2 months.
9%.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. We've used some of those Kvike yeasts at Forbidden Root. In fact, we got one going in right now. We're doing a kind of a fake lagery thing, and there's one strain that I guess is new that is super neutral, kind of lager like. So we're gonna give that a shot and see what that's like.
Probably need everybody to mute other than Randy. I'm hearing some background stuff going on. Music or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I muted that person.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think I've I don't know if anybody else wants to talk about what they've been brewing and share that.
I have an
I have
Oktoberfest.
an Oktoberfest going.
Oh, nice.
Should be packaged in about a week or so.
Fantastic. Yeah, I love those beers. I love the seasons. You know, I love to drink seasonally. So I'm dying for some Oktoberfest beers to come out. So I guess they're on the shelves now. So
Right.
Brewed a Doppelbock.
nice.
Nice.
Yeah, we're making a spiced orange Bock for a Christmas beer at Forbidden Root. So we had the distributors like, please make us some Christmas beer. Like, all right, you got to take it all though. You know, or like whatever you take, we're not taking it back because once Christmas is over, you can't give those away.
Yeah.
Like, well, we'll sell it. We'll sell it.
I'm looking at a Hefeweizen coming up next from the yeast order that we've got coming in on Saturday, I think, from Listerman's.
Mhm.
So that'll be pretty good.
Nice. Yeah, I love those. That's my summer beer.
Okay. Well, I think I shared this with you on the emails, Randy, but we've been doing these virtual meetings since it seems like a couple of years now, but I think started in May. And we've been, it sort of worked out best if we can find people to come and join us like yourself and give some kind of expert opinion and advice. And so we've been really fortunate. We started out, Martin Brungard talked about water with us, and we had Owen Langley from Imperial Yeast. I don't know if you know Owen, but he joined us, talked about yeast. It's Stan Anonymous, and
Stan's always great. I think he's one of our best beer writers.
That guy's amazing. I mean, how much information he has in his head.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah.
And then we had John Mallett from Bell's talk about malt.
Yeah,
So
there's
we've
another one too.
kind of gone through all these the different elements of beer and thought it would be good to then talk about how they all kind of come together and how we perceive that. And then maybe, if you can talk with us about in that perception process of how we sort of evaluate the beer and maybe tweak the beer and go through that whole, how our perception is. And so if you wanted to kind of go through there and really, I kind of wanted to start out asking you about the impact that water has. Most of the stuff that I read, they'll talk about the chlorine, obviously, but then there's
that's usually important.
Yeah, and not a whole lot else about the impact that your water profile has on the other elements, on the hops and on the malt, and what is so if I'm drinking a beer, tasting it, smelling it. Are there things that I can pick out that I could then say, well, that's because of the water, or is it just? I think of all the things that go into beer, water, even though that's the largest ingredient, as long as you don't completely screw it up, it's the least important thing as far as flavor. Obviously, getting rid of the chlorine is really important. Understanding, the basics of pH and alkalinity, and making sure that the water matches the style of beer that you're trying to brew. But early on in my homebrew world, I made 3 water profiles, and then it's like, it's a hoppy pale beer, it's this. If it's a dark beer, it's this. If it's something in the middle, it's this. And I never gave it another thought. And I know that's probably not best brewer practice,
but I think there's so many other things that are going on and so much more to learn about and so much more to wrap your head around when it comes to the ingredients and of course the process and yeast, which is kind of more of a process than an ingredient. And so, I think that's where I'm at. I'm a cook. I was a cook. I learned to cook before I learned to brew. So that was sort of I still think of it that way as kind of an aspect of cuisine. And it's not that the technical stuff's unimportant. It's hugely important, but I'm about approaching it like an artist and trying to understand it from a point of view of what's my desired outcome, and try and understand what that outcome is, like get a handle on that outcome first and then figure out how to get there. So like when I'm working with my breweries, even when I was doing homebrew, the process was always like, what do I want to make? And when I pitch ideas to my partners for beers, or even my brewers, is like, hey, what do you think about this? I always kind of write up the label copy first, and then once you kind of decide on that, then everything needs to follow. And then you have to figure out, well, what's my strategy for getting the malt bill to taste like what you had in mind, and then same with the hops and malt also, you need to make sure that you nail the color, because even though there's not a lot to learn about a beer from the color, they should almost judge it like they do with wine and put it in black glassware, because it can be really color can be really deceiving. But on the other hand, when you're selling beer to consumers, especially, if a beer's a little too light or too dark or too hazy or too clear for the style that it's supposed to be, people really slam it, and they can't help themselves. That's like we're hardwired to be kind of vision dominant, and in a thing like beer, it's really something you have to guard against yourself. That was the whole trick with the black IPAs. The idea was sort of a joke, like we're going to use Cinnamar to make this beer dark colored, but it's really just an IPA. And then people started brewing them like stouts and whatever, but that was the original idea, was to just like be a visual illusion, and so you got to nail the color, and that's not that hard to do. And of course you can always come back at the end of a brew and add a little correction or whatever. You can get some Cinnamar, or you can make a little coloring thing and boil it and cool it down and throw it in, so if the beer's a little light, it's easy enough to darken it up without changing the flavor very much, because those dark malts don't have a ton of flavor. So, in terms of, so water, I don't know, you can definitely mess it up. It's certainly something, if anybody's brewing New England IPAs, that's something where we had to rethink what we were doing with water treatment on those, because the classic calcium sulfate gypsum water treatment for IPAs is completely wrong for the New Englands, because everything about the New England, if you think about, again, that description, it's smooth, it's soft, it's round, it's creamy, it's a little bit of a sweet perception and a very soft bitterness, and you can't get there with sulfate. And so what people generally do is either maybe half and half sulfate and calcium chloride, or maybe 2/3 calcium chloride and 1/3, or maybe even all calcium chloride to get your calcium. So that's that, because again, it's what that end product needs to be, and then water, this is what you need to do to get that end product. But in malt, there's some really interesting things about malt, and I think in my observation in general is that most brewers, maybe even professionals more than homebrewers, don't really understand their malt as well as they think they should, or that they think they do. And I think one thing, if you did Rick, did you get those sheets sent out to people, or no?
Send them on to Andrew, and Andrew, are we going to be able to?
I sent them out via email to our list.
All right. Well, I'll just talk through them. I sent some documents. I didn't get it done till today. I'm working on this book, and it's kind of making me crazy because it's going so slow. So, one thing about malt is that it's basically a cooked product. So the flavors in malt are from Maillard primarily, except in crystal malt you get some non-Maillard caramelization, and there's a couple of really important things to remember. Color is not flavor, as Michael Lewis of UC Davis is always fond of saying that there's a million different ways to get to any given color. So just getting the color doesn't really make a beer taste the way the color, looks. And so like in an Oktoberfest versus an amber ale versus an English pale ale, those are the same color, but they have completely different characteristics because the malts used are different, and the malts are different because the kilning process is different. So to understand Maillard, it's protein products like peptides and amino acids combined with carbohydrates in the presence of heat and moisture. And the specifics of those things really change what the outcome is. And when you start heating things, you get a certain set of chemicals at lower temperatures, and then as the temperature goes up, you get different chemicals. If you kiln it moist as opposed to killing it dry, you get, say, a melanoidin malt or a dark Munich as opposed to like a biscuit type of malt. So the biscuit is dry and it's very sharp and tangy, and it makes brown ale, and it's like a beautiful flavor, but you wouldn't want to use it in a Munich dark or a Belgian double. It's completely wrong because of the moisture level, even though the color is the same. And so and then you get darker and darker, but then and as it gets darker, the flavor builds, which is what you'd expect to happen. But you get about halfway through, you get up to about 80, and at that point, the flavor is so horrible that they don't sell any malt from about 80 to about 200, with a very few exceptions of some dark caramel malts. And the reason they don't sell it is it tastes like crap. It tastes like ashtray, right? Because those flavors keep building up and building up and building up, and they get more and more potent and more ashy. And what happens when you hit about 200, now you've raised the temperature of that malt to the point where those harsh flavors are volatilizing and leaving the grain. And the maltsters, in fact, do a process where they will spray or sprinkle the malt with water, which hits the surface of the malt and immediately vaporizes into steam, creating a vacuum and sucking out a lot of those harsh volatile compounds. So when you go to a chocolate malt, that's the most intense malt, and you go to a dark chocolate, that's less intense, even though the color's darker. And you go to a black malt, and it's even less intense because it's had this time to blow off all these volatile molecules, right? So it's counterintuitive unless you understand what the malting process is. So one of the things that I sent to you guys, which you'll get around when you check your email or when that gets sent, is an evaluation sheet. And this is once you get the club back together, this is something that's really great to do as a club activity, is to get a bunch of different kinds of malts and make some teas and taste them. Because like at Forbidden Root, we wanted to just really kill a chocolate beer, to just make something that was just great. And we started thinking about it. We realized that between my brewer and myself, we didn't really have a very good mental picture of what all these different malts taste like. You got different you got light and dark chocolates, you've got black malt, you got light black malt, you got like the Carafa 1, 2, and 3, you got German ones, you got Belgian ones, you got English ones. You guys all know what all those taste like? Because we didn't, and that's a lot of malt to kind of work your way through recipe by recipe. And it's hard to evaluate when you're just brewing one at a time. And it really is helpful. And my cat's a little out of control here today, so, but he's young. But the sheet is sort of a sheet that you can use to take notes on different kinds of malts. And there's a process on there for making a type of a malt tea, where you take 100 grams of malt and 250 grams of water, and you heat that water up, and you soak the crushed malt in there, and you can run it through a coffee filter, or I've even thought about doing it in an espresso machine. It might work to just make like super quick malt tea and let it stand and let it settle out because you get some crud. But then you can take that with dark malts. You can take those and just mix that right in with a like a lager beer, and you can really evaluate the flavors of those dark malts. And what we found when we tasted all those things is that some of them are really some of them were, because we were looking for a beer like malts to make chocolate beer with. And we thought, well, as long as we're tasting, let's be on the lookout for beers that we can make a coffee beer with, because some of those malts taste more like coffee. And then what are ones that are just dead neutral that have flavors that we might want to make just a stout. And so what we found is that some of them tasted like coffee, as we thought. Some of them tasted like really crappy diner coffee. Some of the chocolate malts in particular had a lot of that sort of burnt coffee kind of smell to them. And then some of them tasted like really fine espresso. Some of them tasted like kind of Hershey's sort of not very good chocolate, which is a useful chocolate note to have in your toolkit. That's something that people know and has some value and use. Some of them were more like fine Belgian couverture chocolate. So now we've got 20 malts in our library that we have had done those tests and done with this and done evaluations on. So we've got a vocabulary. So when we're making a beer, we can go back to that. And draw from that. And again, that's something everybody, I think that's one of the things about recipes that brewers I know who are really good recipe guys, they have this library in their head, and just because I'm working on this big book on tasting. And one of the things that I'm, finding out is that the ability to, you can learn to imagine aroma, right? But it's not something that most people do in their normal lives. But chefs do it, brewers do it, to be able to have this vocabulary in your head and sort of imagine, okay, I'm going to take this malt and I'm going to put it in the grain bin, and then I'm going to add this one, I'm going to add this one. And if you've brewed enough beer and work with these ingredients enough, you can kind of actually start to create a beer in your head, and certainly chefs do that, and people who work in the flavor, that's the whole game in the flavor creation industry for people who make fragrances and flavorings for food products and things like that. They got 1,000 chemicals and they know them all by name. And it's like, oh, strawberry, that's this and this and this and this and this. And they put it together and needs a little more of this. And, so that's kind of how it is. That's the extreme of it, right? But I think being able to do that, yourself is pretty helpful. It's also same with crystal malt. We did years ago at the Chicago Beer Society, we got 20 different kinds of crystal malt and just laid them all out on the table. And you'd be amazed at how different each manufacturer's crystal malt of the same color is. Some like a 40 Lovibond that can be hugely varied because everybody makes those a little bit different. There's no one standard way to make a crystal malt. Everybody tweaks those formulas. They're actually pretty secretive about them. I was working on a homebrew book a few years ago and I couldn't get anybody to tell me anything about honey malt. What is that? How's that made? Yeah, sorry, proprietary. So do some of that when you can. And also hop rubbing. One of the other things that I sent you is a sheet that you can use to evaluate hops. And anybody done the hop rub before? Do you know how to do that? You basically just take whatever hops you got. If they're pellets, you need to kind of break them up a little bit first. But the idea is to put some of them on the heel of your hand like this, and just rub it together and get a lot of friction on there, and rub it till it gets hot and starts to get sticky, and your hands stick together. And then do that, and then just open put your face in your palms and give it a good sniff. It works way better than teas or anything else that I've ever used. I never had any good luck doing evaluation with teas. And of course, if you're really ambitious, you can do a 5-gallon batch and split it into 1 gallon little mini batches and do some little dry hop trials and things like that. If you're that sort of maybe phase 2, but to get your vocabulary straight, that's really pretty easy to do. And you can't really rely on what the hops names are. Because, a lemon drop hop, guess what? You're going to think that smells like lemon. Citra, what's that smell like? Well, citrus. Well, not really. Kind of, sort of, but not really. You know, hops are tough because the chemicals, like there's 500 chemicals or more in hops, and not any one of those chemicals tastes exactly like any one thing you already know. You know, they're present in everything. There are these terpenoids, they're in spices, and they're in herbs, and they're in citrus, and they're in all these fruits, but by themselves, you know, to smell linalool, it's either orange or it's lavender or it's coriander. And in fact, it's pretty high percentage in all those things, but each of those things has other things in it. So you never have one thing. And another thing about aroma is that the way we process aroma, even a single chemical affects multiple different olfactory receptors. So a mixture presents a pattern to your brain of a bunch of different receptor activations at different amounts, and you get a picture, and your brain looks at the picture like we look at faces, and it says, oh, I recognize that, that's a strawberry. But even a single chemical can activate multiple receptors and present you with a picture. And no matter how many chemicals you get, it only presents the picture at the same intensity. So you have this scaling system built into your olfactory thing. So single chemicals can be really confusing. And I know people that say, oh, this beer's brewed with Mosaic and Galaxy, and I can pick out each of those hops. It's like, no, you fucking can't. You know, it's just not possible, because there's 500 chemicals, and they're all the same chemicals in both hops. And the only difference is a little higher here, a little lower here, a little higher here, a little lower there. And so to think you can do that is insane. I mean, it just shows that you don't really, you don't get it. You don't really know what you're talking about in that regard. So doing those rubs, and especially, you know, if there's new varieties out and, you know, that you haven't worked with, there's a lot of, you know, there's the famous ones that are Mosaic and Citra and Galaxy, and the ones that are in high demand and everybody loves them on the label. But there's a lot of other really nice hops that just haven't broken through yet, that are equally good, and you might like them better for what, you know. So get your hands on hops. Do that as a club activity too. And so the chart I gave you is basically a spider chart that I cooked up for my Mastering Homebrew book a few years ago, and it's like a seven-sided, what would be called a heptagon, I guess. And so, you know, there are let's see here. So there's a citrus. It goes from citrus to resin to herbal to pungent, which is kind of a catch-all for stuff we don't like, to floral to fruity to tropical. And within each of those, there's some subdivisions on there. So, you know, herbal breaks down to grass, thyme, and mint. And floral breaks down to lavender, marigold, and rose. And so, you know, and by using each one of those major flavor categories and putting a dot further to the outside if that character is strong and further to the inside if the character is weak, then you get this sort of jagged star-like pattern that you can kind of instantly, your mind can look at and recognize, oh, this is that really fruity one that doesn't have much resiny quality or whatever it is, you know. So that's a really good exercise. And again, the more you discipline you can put to yourselves, and the more experience you can get in a structured kind of situation where you're really evaluating these and focusing on them and doing a lot of ingredients pretty quickly, it gives you a lot of stuff to work with when you go. It'll give you ideas too, because it's like, oh, this hop is really nice. I never thought about it. It makes me think of maybe this would be good in a Belgian IPA or whatever, you know, pops to mind. So sometimes you can get ideas. And also then you've just got this sort of mental raw material to use to help you put stuff together. Make sense so far?
Yes.
Hope so.
Yeah.
So then you got to start thinking about your recipe. And one of the other things, a couple other things on there are more or less about sort of formulation. There's a sheet there that is kind of a recipe overview that I pulled out of Mastering Homebrew. And it's really like trying to think about each style of beer as a mix of certain kind of malt characteristics. Like one of the problems that any complex creation can have is too many things just all sort of tossed in, right? So the worst way to do a recipe is to think, well, I guess I always use a pale ale malt, so I guess I'll start with that and just throw a bunch of that in there, and then I don't know, well, let's see, maybe we'll put some 20 Levelbound Crystal, and I don't know, I've got some of this Munich sitting around, I'll add some of that, so I mean, I think that's easy to do, is just to like, I don't know, let's just give it a shot, and that's okay to do, but if you want to really make excellent beer, it's good to, like, again, figure out what that outcome is. Like, if you think about that Oktoberfest, what's a characteristic of that beer from a malt point of view? Anybody want to venture a guess? Somebody's drinking one, so it should be fresh in your mind. Like, how would you describe that malt?
I would say bready and toasty.
Bready and toasty, but not toast like toast, like more like toasted cake. Bread crust, or maybe like I always find there's like a carameliness, almost like toasted brioche or something like that. Like a sweet kind of toastiness, and that's
right.
from that Vienna malt. And also there's a little bit of like a pure clean caramel that I find in Vienna malt too, and it can get a little cloying. So you have to be a little careful with that sometimes. I mean, the classic recipe is just Vienna malt. That makes an Oktoberfest. But, for modern taste, that can be a little heavy. So now you've got, like, I want this Vienna malt flavor, so I'm going to use some Vienna malt, but I'm going to thin it down with Pilsner. Now I have another problem. The beer is going to be too pale if I want that deep kind of orangey color. So where do you go from there? Well, Munich is the next thing darker than Vienna. Right, so it kind of makes sense to use Munich maybe at about half, because it's going to give you about twice the color for the amount of grain that you put in there. So Munich is good, and then if you look at it and you find you're still a little too low in color, just put a little black malt in. Put like whatever your beersmith or whatever you're working with says, and that'll make it dark. I mean, they put that stuff in Miller Lite. And you don't know that it doesn't taste roasty because they're just using it kind of add a little color. And so, you can always go back in and do that as well. And so, and of course, in a pale beer, your choices are a lot more limited because you got to keep it pale. You can't use a lot of black malt, or you can't really use, anything darker than about 25 or so at the most. And even that would be pretty small amount. So, Vienna, Munich, Pils. The other thing is also like Pils malt is not just Pils malt. There's a lot of variation there. We formulated a number of different really pale beers at Five Rabbit, and even Brees has 3 different Pils malts that you can work with. One of them is their classic lager malt, which is just like dead neutral American, which means no flavor. It's kind of bred for American beer, which is what they call neutral, which means flavorless. And there's nothing wrong with that. It has uses, but you're not going to get a real beery flavor out of it. And then there's one called Full Pint and one called Synergy, and one of them is more like a European type of malt, and one of them is sort of halfway there. So those are nice. There's also the European malts tend to be pretty full and rich and kind of have that great malted milk kind of quality to them. But there's one called a Heidelberg that's I think that's from Best, maybe, one of the German maltsters. And it's a really, really, really pale one. And it's actually got a lot of nice grassy notes. So with the right hops and the right, like if you wanted to make a Pils that's like a real like classic North German, super dry, hoppy, a little bit grassy, that's a great choice for it. So, you look at a Pils, even thinking about Pils malt, there's a lot more variation there than you might think. And it's hard to evaluate those. That's the kind of thing where you really have to brew some beers and try them out to see what you're going to get, So, and again, so just getting your lips on this stuff and trying it, tasting it, super important. And then when you come to hops, it's really, what type of beer you're making and trying to match the hop character to the style. But also, when I started homebrewing, it was like you put a half an ounce in the boil and another half an ounce halfway through, and then another half an ounce at the end. It was sort of like boom, boom, boom. But that actually gives you way more bitterness than you're going to get aroma. So what I found that when I started calculating formulas, I was putting my hop total BUs together and deciding to break it not by ounces, but break it by BUs, right? So if you're doing 50 BUs and you want half of your bitterness to come from your first charge of hops at the beginning of the boil, you probably only need to put 10 or 20% of your hops in that beginning, right? So you get a much better distribution of where your bitterness is coming from. And what that means is you're going to get a lot more hop aroma for any given bitterness. Now, of course, everything's crazy now, especially with the New Englands and people just wanting more hop aroma and not wanting much bitterness. And so, the strategy was originally to just and this is what we're doing, is put minimal hops in the boil, just enough to help precipitate some proteins, and then put more, like some hops in the whirlpool. Like in a commercial brewery, we get 20 to 25% utilization just in a whirlpool, right? Because it's going to sit in there 45 minutes and it's like 230 degrees because it's a big tank and it's hot at the bottom of it, right? But in homebrew, your utilizations are different. And then of course, with massive amounts of dry hopping, you've got, I've got homebrew recipes for 5-gallon batch with as much as a pound of dry hops for like a triple IPA. It's just insane. But that's what the market's looking for in those big New England IPAs. They really want a ton of aroma. And what you get is you actually get, like, you can do an IBU reading measure on those beers, but it doesn't give you results that match the perceived bitterness, because there's a lot of hop compounds that when you dry hop like that, you get a lot of hop compounds that also contribute bitterness. I'm sure Stan talked about that too, so I won't go on and on about hops. But again, it's like, learn them. They're personal. We found a lot that the magic is blending. Because we can't go out and pay $35 a pound for Galaxy on every batch. It's just like you got to be self-distributing and selling beer for a pretty high price to be able to make that work. And so you gotta work with the hops that maybe aren't as famous, but still have a lot of lovely aromas. There's a ton of nice hops out there. We use El Dorado a lot. It has a real clean flavor. It's kind of pineapple-y to our taste, and it works well with a lot of other hops. It plays nicely. I think also, like, for me, hops are almost as much about what's not in there as what is in there, right? So a lot of those, especially the New Zealand hops and a lot of the other newer hops, they don't have a lot of geraniol in it. Now, geraniol is that chemical that is very high in all the C hops, Cascade, and all of those. That's that pungent, like marigold type of hop floral character. And I don't like it. I never have really enjoyed that characteristic. Certainly, if you're making a West Coast ale, you better have some geraniol in there. But like El Dorado seems to be pretty low in geraniol. So we like working with that because it doesn't, that even a little geraniol kind of gets in the way and fights the fruitiness, right? You're paying a lot of money for really good hops, but if you blend them down with something with geraniol in it, you're kind of throwing the money away because it's like that geraniol is very pungent, and it tends to, like, some flavors just dominate other flavors. There's a pecking order in what flavors your brain will recognize, and so you have to be careful about not adding things that are gonna bring the whole thing down. So that's one thing we think about too. So let's see. Oh, the other thing that might be useful to you, I don't know, depends on what you're trying to do. One thing I like to do in commercial situations especially is to do rapid prototyping. And this is really good if you're trying to do something that's kind of new, like if you're trying to make, say, a Belgian IPA, and you really don't have a lot of experience doing them and you're really not sure what to do, you might get some Belgian beer. You might get like a Leffe or something like that. You might get a bottle of triple. You might get a bottle of something that's a little more amber, to have a little color, a little more malty and rich. If you're doing a darker beer, then obviously you can start working with things like double and so on. But you can basically do little tabletop blend ups. You can make a beer. You can make beer a glass at a time, and you can make some hop tea. You can, which kind of sort of works, or you can even just like take hops and crush them up real good and sprinkle them in there, and you can smell the malt and smell that hop, and you'll get some approximation of what the beer's going to be like when it's finished. And then you go back and you look at it and say, okay, this is 50% of a beer that's 7%. That's probably all Pils malt. It's all Belgian. And then another beer that is, tastes like it's some melanoidin and maybe a little bit of like caramel 20, and that's 15% of the beer. And then, so you just get as much information about those beers, either from tasting them or from stuff that's published out there, which there is sometimes some good information. And then you can go back and formulate a recipe to get what you tasted. So if you're ever, like, for example, trying to brew for a beer for somebody's wedding, right? That's always something I really had a lot of fun doing, is trying to like figure out what people would want and then talk to them about what I was going to brew. But you could actually like cook, not really even cook, just blend up a beer. And then of course, when you're working with things like fruit and spice and herbs and chilies and all that kind of stuff, that is the best way to do it, hands down. Is to create the beer as best you can in the base form, and then start dosing it with calibrated tinctures or fruit puree or juice or whatever you've got available to work with it, and you can really make a lot of progress and get a recipe that'll get that level of fruit about right. You can also make up some dilutions of acidity, so you can make a 10-to-1 of lactic acid, a 10-to-1 of citric, maybe 10-to-1 of malic acid, which are all, they're all acids, but each one of them has a unique characteristic. And some fruits have a lot of one and not any other. Fruits don't have lactic, but if you're trying to do a sour, you can always put that lactic acid in, and that gives you a pretty good approximation of like a kettle sour for a Goza or something. And so the one thing about fruit, we do a lot of fruit beers at both locations with both the breweries and both locations at Forbidden Root. And it's important to, one thing that's really, I had this epiphany years ago, but as we were working with these, the critical thing on fruit beer is that everybody knows what the fruit tastes like, right? Unless it's some weird tropical thing. You know what a pineapple tastes like. You know what a pear or a peach or an apricot or a strawberry or whatever. Everybody's got a really good image of that in your head. Now you're making a beer and you're trying to recreate that picture in people's minds using about 10% fruit, right? And no matter how much fruit you use, if you ferment it, you lose the sweetness, right? So the trick with fruit beers is understanding what that fruit character is and finding ways to add as much back to that beer as you can to replace the missing 90%, right? So color, again, people drink with their eyes. And so you can use hibiscus. There are commercial coloring materials you can use. There's like elderberry is really dark. Choke cherry, or what do they call it? Aronia is also really dark. So you can use a little bit of a really dark colored fruit to bring the color up. Like you make a strawberry beer, that color is very light to begin with, and it's completely unstable. So after like 3 weeks, that strawberry is just a golden beer, right? So you can use hibiscus. That's better. It's not completely stable, but if it's homebrew and you know how long it's going to have to last, it's good for, it'll lose about half its color in about 6 weeks, right? So a lot of those colors aren't real stable. So for the market, it's different than a homebrew thing. But so you can get the color right. Really easy to get acidity right. Again, just make up some 1 to 10 solution of citric acid or lactic or whatever and try them out, because like sometimes you want that bite of citric. If you're making a passion fruit beer, you may get enough acidity from the passion fruit because it's really sour. But if you're making a peach beer, you need some acidity there because peach is not super high in acid, but there's some acidity to peach flavor. So you can nail the acidity. Then you got to try and do what you can for the mouthfeel, right? So can you mash it like 162? Right? That's crazy hot. Like I know most homebrewers are kind of scared of like high mash temperatures like that, but you can use more ingredients and mash hot and get to the same level of alcohol. So now you've done two things. One is you've got a lot of residual sweetness in there. And second is you use more malt, which is actually has this sweet aromatic characteristic that will like your brain wants to be fooled. Like if you give people half a clue, they'll put 2 and 2, they'll put 1 and 1 together and get 4. But if you give them 5, 1 and 1, they're not going to get to 10. You know what I mean? So like every little thing you can do really brings that up, really brings up the realism of those things. And then let's see what else. Color. Sweetness is a little difficult, although people seem to be perfectly happy to put lactose in their beers these days. So, go for it. It's not the most natural type of sweetness, but again, your brain just needs a little help. It doesn't really have to be as sweet as an actual fruit. And most fruit, like strawberry, is about 5% sugar. I think a cherry is about 10. So most of the common fruits are not super high. Like pears pretty high, dates are super high, but a little sweetness will go a long way towards that. And also having enough fruity aroma, because if you give people sweetened water, well, if you give people something that's maybe thickened a little bit, has some texture to it, but it smells fruity, their brain is going to perceive that as sweet, because that association with sweetness, like that's a deep association that we have in our brains, and we don't think in individual chemicals or individual ingredients or even individual senses. Like if if you put vanilla in something and you hand it to somebody, what do you smell? Oh, it smells sweet. Well, there's no such thing as smelling sweet, but there it is. That's the way their brain is interpreting that aroma, because the inevitable context for vanilla in Western culture is it's in context with stuff that's sweet, right? So you got to rely on those expectations. It's a powerful tool. Brewing is really applied psychology and understanding how people think and learning how to get them there, give them cues that match what their expectations are, and setting up the expectations. Again, in a commercial setting, the naming, the packaging, the color of the packaging, like all those things are not unimportant. They are real things that will absolutely change the way things taste to people. So that, when you're talking about your beer and sharing your beer, you got to make sure people have that expectation for what they're getting. And finally, there are some fruits that are just difficult. Strawberry's hard. Peaches are really tough because the primary thing in peaches is this chemical called gamma-decalactone. And they call it the fuzzy peach chemical. And it is very unstable in beer, and it seems to go away in fermentation a lot. So even if you can get really good fresh peaches or frozen peaches and puree them, it's very hard to get enough peach flavor. But you can get a little bit of, they sell those extracts at the homebrew shops usually, and you don't want to really rely on those to do the heavy lifting and make the bulk of the flavoring for your beer. But to be able to come back in after fermentation and just like ding, and put a little top note in it, makes all the difference. We do that with our strawberry basil hefeweizens in it, Forbidden Root. We looked at a lot of different natural strawberry flavor extracts, and we came up with an English wild strawberry type and an American just like regular strawberry, and we used like about 2 parts of the one to 1 part of another. But it's like, it's like, I don't know, what quantity would be like half a liter per 10-barrel batch or something like that. It's not a ton. It's just a little, because we use real strawberry puree. We use regular puree, and we also use a concentrated puree that has a little bit of a jam note that adds a little depth to the strawberry flavor, we think. And then we come back in with these 2 top notes that we did the pipette tests and just tried them out, and we found the ones that we liked and found the ratio that we like, and that's given us pretty good results, and those tend to be a little more stable. So what else? I mean, that's a pretty good rundown on recipes. I don't know if we want to. If you got questions, I can keep talking.
Well, do you ever use the technique of blending beers to get to the final point?
We don't because we're in small brewery situations, and especially in the brew pub situation. If we want something, we'll just blend it down. We'll just brew it. We do a lot of one-off kegs. We found during COVID that we're trying to find every way possible to give people another reason to come to our pub. Like, come every day, because we have something new almost every day. Because we've got a lot of beers, and they don't all move at the same speed. So we've got some beers that just naturally are going to sit around a little bit longer. So we pull some of those out, and our brewer will make a keg of this and a keg of that. And we've got a company in Chicago now that called Fresh Press that's like a hipster cocktail juice company. And so they'll press out fresh watermelon juice, and you get it, you order it, you get it. It was pressed the day before. So it's real fruit, real fresh. Now, you can't put that in packaging because you can't add whole fruit puree to beer and put it in package. It'll blow up, right? But for those one-off kegs that we're in our own brewery, we just throw them in the tank. Like, you can easily do that and split it. If you're brewing a bigger batch, you can split it among small cornies, or if you're doing 10 gallons, you can make two and make one a fruit beer and one not, or one, two different fruit beers or whatever. And of course, you can always just make syrups and stuff and squirt it in, or use a Randall, or do something a little crazy like that for club night or whatever. But, so it doesn't serve a purpose. I know there are some homebrewers. I think there was a couple that were pretty famous for winning a lot of competitions, and they brewed about 6 base beers that all had they carefully thought them out to have certain characteristics, and then they would blend those together and get like 20 beers out of that would all fit the category and all have the right kind of malt characteristics. So, there's a lot of reasons to do it. It's for us, commercially, it doesn't really make that much sense. Now big breweries, that's what they do, right? You don't think Anheuser-Busch brews all those beers that they sell. They brew them all at high strength, and then they dilute them down various degrees. And, there's a whole engineering process to that to create the fewest number of brew house variations possible to get the number of products that you want to put in the market. So, it's a valuable technique, but depends on what your needs are. Works good. One of these
aspiring beer judge, do you have any suggestions? I know it's kind of a little bit different than recipe formulation, but do you have any suggestions for me? I worked, a bunch of us have taken the test here in January, and we've been with Rick and Will, and been kind of going through the categories each month, having one of these meetings every month, and it's been really, just very eye-opening. So do you have any suggestions for us to keep on getting better?
No, that kind of thing. I mean, practice makes perfect. There's a guy that was working at one of the companies that makes those flavor spikes, that you put in beer to put butter, diacetyl in them or whatever. And he's amazing. Like, I've never seen anybody like this guy in terms of just acuity and being tuned into things. But, he said, made some comments like, "Oh, I'm way out of shape. I haven't trained for like 6 weeks." Right. And that's a professional, who's had the training from like one of the best guys in the world. But for him, if he didn't keep up with it, he would lose it. And because, like, I've talked to a lot of people for this book, which is a book about tasting. It's not about beer at all. I mean, I talk about beer because it's something I know about, and it's instructive in certain areas, but it's really about tasting everything. And it's really a deep dive on the science. So the first 2/3 of the book is about the science of tasting, and the last third is more or less the practical part. But one thing everybody told me is that there are no real, genuine, actual super smellers out there. The people who do well with it I mean, there's certainly people who have some impairments, but there's nobody, it's not really even possible to be super sensitive to everything, because you have 400 separate genes that control your olfactory system, right? So, and they're not all in the same place, right? It's 400 different genes spread across your genome. And so there's no set of mutations that you could have that would make you super sensitive to everything. There's a thing they call a super taster, but it's like very specific about one bitter receptor, and it has some other effects, but it's not what it sounds like, right? So know that you can do it, but you need to understand two things. One, you need to understand what the industry vocabulary is, right? What the terms that people use are, and then you have to internalize, when you smell a certain chemical, what do you think of, right? So acetaldehyde is a great example of that. I went for years looking for green apple, because that is the classic descriptor. It was, at the time, in all the books, that's the only thing anybody said about acetaldehyde was, oh, it smells like green apples. So I'm thinking Jolly Rancher, but and then one day I thought, no, it's grassy. And maybe like a lawnmower, like the underside of a lawnmower that ran over some rotten apples. That was my first time when it actually, like, I had a mental picture in my head that matched acetaldehyde. And then somebody said, oh no, it's like pumpkin guts. I was like, yeah, it's like pumpkin guts too. And it's like latex paint. And it's like drunk breath, because it is drunk breath. And so it's like you have to like, and in fact, they've done studies that show that language can interfere with that kind of process. That if you only read the book and have that expectation on what that language is, you may never get it, right? And that's why I bring that acetaldehyde example up, because that's one it's not like the buttery chemical. Everybody knows what butter smells like. That's a good one. Malt is easy, because malt is like bread, cookies, crackers, cake, toffee, chocolate, coffee. That's a good vocabulary because it's universal just about. But those off flavor chemicals, they're a lot tougher. The Cicerone program, wants people to know about 25 of them that sort of match, I think approximately matches that Siebel 24 kit one. I would highly recommend, as a club activity or for whatever, however you want to do it, especially for people who are doing BJCP, because they're going to test you on that stuff. And if you haven't gone through and done them, you would be really, it would behoove you to do it. And you learn a lot. And again, just like just doing it and practicing and getting some experience, because our normal, even as a home brewer, it's rare to like sit down in a quiet room with a glass of beer and a piece of paper and just focus on that for 15 minutes. That's something that, like, no, who's got time for that? It's not something that people, and especially, why judging is important, because now you're sitting at a table with other people that might know more than you, or they certainly know different things than you, right? So everybody can kind of share, like, you can share technique, you can share, like, oh, I'm getting this. Oh yeah, there it is, right? You've had those kind of conversations. Sometimes we just need a little triggering, because like the hardest thing you can do is to blindly identify unknown things. It's really, really hard. Like, if you know that this is in here, it's way, way, way easier to find it. Even if you've got two glasses in front of you and one of them has acetaldehyde, you're going to find it because now you have this knowledge that this one has something, this one doesn't have. And maybe I can wrap my head around it. So any of those things you can do to learn that vocabulary. And, there's, like they do with wine a lot, is they'll actually create a little bit of a vocabulary in a glass kind of thing to introduce people. In fact, Lauren, who's the cellar manager at New Belgium, said that she used to do this a lot for people that were coming into her program. And they would just like set up, she would go to the grocery store and buy 10 different fruits and buy some spice, have some spices and have some herbs and stuff. And she would put it in plastic cups with a plastic lid. And the idea is you just like sniff it. Like, can you identify that fruit blindly? Can you tell the difference between a pineapple and a passion fruit and a mango? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. It's harder than it's harder than it looks, so anything you can do along those lines. And I always sort of half jokingly say that, you should just walk around your neighborhood and smell things. Do you know the difference between Crest and Colgate toothpaste? Because all those toothpaste use different ingredients, and we brush our teeth twice a day, and they go completely. That's like something we never pay a slightest bit of attention. Some of them have allspice, some of them have anise, some of them have more peppermint, some of them have more spearmint. Some of them have hot stuff in them to give you a little burn, a little tingle to make it feel like it's working. So like, in fact, one of the people, a flavorist that I was asking about, like, well, how do you pick people, when you're talking to people that want to come into your program and train and be apprentice, like 7 to 10 year apprenticeship to become a flavorist. She said, quite literally, we try and find people who smell the roses. That they are people who are just naturally curious, who pay attention to things in their daily life, who are interested and want to know more about everything. And so I think like having that point of view as an artist, as a brewer, that's the best thing you can do, is to just be like, always know that there's so much more to know, and take in as much as you can. So.
What do you do if you're smelling a beer, tasting a beer, and there's something in there that you just can't identify? It's something, you're getting something you can't put your finger on, kind of thing. Is there some process that you go through to try to figure out what am I getting here?
Well, yeah, a couple things. One is you can always leave it and come back, because if you smell too hard, you saturate your receptors, right? They adapt to the smell. So it's like if you're painting a room and you leave the house to buy more paint and you come back in, it's like, whoa, I can really smell that paint now. That's how it works. So you can like smell too hard. And some chemicals, especially like a lot of those lighter sulfur compounds, you'll max out on those like right away, which is why the professionals say, can you taste the beer from here? They do this thing called a drive-by tasting, which is just like, just sort of bring it by. And I've got a Forbidden Root, a rye IPA here, and I can smell this beautiful pineapple-y kind of hop aroma from 6 or 8 inches away. I can smell it. It's sitting on the table, and I can smell it a little. If I stuck that right up my nose, it might not be as good. So that's one thing. Another thing is that, can you get close, right? If you think about the world of flavors are divided in by chemicals. And so the professionals who are flavorists and perfumers, they know the chemical groups. So they know the esters from the aldehydes, from the lactones, and down. And then they also know them by molecular size, right? Because any one of those chemicals, because they're hydrocarbons, they'll start at an ethyl and go to a butyl and a tetryl and whatever. They go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units. And as they get larger, they get heavier, more oily, less bright, less fresh, more kind of weird. And that may be good, that may not be good. And so they categorize by chemical group. And so if you can categorize by those broad categories of like herbal, fruity, like start with whatever vocabulary you can get, and then try and drill down, So if it's something that smells like animal, okay, that's a really useful descriptor. And in fact, on the Cicerone Master Exam, they give them one taste panel with a dozen beers on it that are chemicals that no one in the program is supposed to actually know, right? They're not the mandatory ones. But what they're looking for is if people can put them into the categories. They can say, oh, it's musty, or it's vegetal, or it's animal, or like they're looking for whatever information people can give them about it, even though they can't like identify it as ethyl butyrate or whatever it happens to be. So that's another really useful thing. Like, get what you can get, So if you can get it down a little bit, and then if you got other people around you that like, what does this remind you of? The biggest thing is to not ever filter yourself, like, because your brain knows. If it's something you've ever smelled before, it's up here already. My wife loves beer. She's not an expert, but I got her kind of trained to not filter. So we were at a champagne tasting a couple of years ago around the holidays, and she picks up a glass of champagne and kind of swirls it and goes, horseradish. And like any normal person would never blurt that out in the middle of a champagne tasting, but she knows that that's the best way to get at it. And so I pick up the glass, and it's like, oh yeah, it's a little musty. It was a little corky. So it had a little bit of that moldy cork thing. Not a lot, just a little bit. But it also, something about that wine had a bit of spiciness to it. So you put musty and spicy together, you get horseradish. Like that, the brain makes the picture. It was super vivid. And so whatever idiotic thing pops into your head, go with that. If you're ever taking a test and just something crazy that you know for sure can't be it pops into your head, write that down. Because it's probably correct. You're never, like, your brain has no reason to lie to you about that.
Can you sort of then drill down and to figure out what that really is? Because I've had this experience numerous times where I'll get something and it'll remind me of something I know it's not there. Most recently, the one that pops into my mind had a beer and it reminded me of peanuts. And I thought, it smells like peanuts. Mm-hmm. I didn't taste peanuts, but it smelled like peanuts. So I'm trying to figure out, what is that really? What am I really getting at there?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. Peanuts have a lot of, because they're a roasted type of product, they've got a lot of those kiln flavors, like pyrazines is sort of one of those common flavors that you get in lighter color malts. Could have been something like that. Again, it's just sort of understanding the vocabulary. It might have been some yeast thing. It's hard to say. If there's anything else going on, if the beer's sour versus not sour, that's going to lead you in a certain direction, because now if you're into sour bacteria, they're going to have a certain different set of chemistry than a normal yeast kind of fermentation is. So, a light beer versus a dark beer, there's different expectations. Certainly the flavors that are coming from the malt. Sometimes it's just like, I don't know. You can't figure it out. You can't afford, can't even if you had a, gas chromatograph, it'd still be hard to figure out. So, but you file those away, and sometime maybe you'll taste something else that like reminds you of what that smell was, and it's in a context, or maybe that's a little clearer to you. So I don't know. It's an art, not a science.
So maybe shifting gears here a little bit. Can you talk about like the perception of you get astringency? I hear people talk about astringency, and to me, a lot of times I don't know if I'm confused or if they're confused as to what they're really perceiving there. If it's, I know it's a polyphenol kind of a thing or something, but it seems like there's different things that are going on that seem like we identify as astringent maybe.
Yeah, I just got done with that with the mouthfeel chapter, so I'm really up on this stuff right now. It's both, it's complicated, but it's also simple. Like, there appears to be only two different mechanisms for creating astringency in your mouth, and one of them is the fact that tannic and other polyphenolic compounds will bind to the proteins in your saliva and thin them out, and take them off your tongue, so that your tongue is more naked and not coated with this lubricating coat of saliva, and it'll feel rougher. But there's also chemicals that they can get a reaction out of cells in a petri dish, which obviously don't have a tongue to rub against anything. And so, and if you actually take a sip of wine and make a great effort not to touch your tongue to anything, a lot of that astringency in that wine will still be there. So there's a second mechanism, and they're not really sure what causes it. They know that it's certain types of molecular parts called gal oil units that are in it. If it has a lot of gal oil in it, it's going to give you that finer tannin, a smoother, softer, cleaner, more desirable tannin or type of characteristic astringent mouthfeel. But beyond that, they don't really know. And because there's hundreds of these chemicals in wine, the 2-year-old wine only has half of the same chemistry in it as far as mouthfeel and the polyphenols as it did when it was young. So wine constantly evolves because these chemicals are super reactive. They're full of these groups. They're very reactive. They react with each other. They react with proteins. They react with fats. They react with oxygen, like they scavenge radical oxygen molecules and stuff. They're actually proving to be really healthy for you. But I saw a wine wheel when I was working on this chapter that had 19 different words to describe mouthfeel in wine. And they were like silk and satin and cotton. And then there were just all these crazy words, but you get all that out of 2 mechanisms, right? So, reality is sort of what we perceive, but the chemical reality underneath it is somewhere there's really only 2 different kinds of flavors that should present themselves. We may find that it turns out to be a lot more complex, but right now it looks like people are just adding complexity to it because that is the perception of it. Now, in beer, it's generally negative, right? In all beer except for, Budweiser, where they like a little astringency because that comes from the rice and that gives them a little bit of that bite. It's common in cold weather barleys and hot weather barleys. So in Canadian beer, Chinese beer, Indian beer, those barleys make more tannins and polyphenols because they're protective. So these are basically plant protective compounds. And one of the things it protects against is too much or too little heat. And so cold or hot climate barleys will have it, but they're like, if you like your Canadian beer, that's fine, but that's generally considered a negative characteristic. Now, in wood-aged beer, that's between the acid and the tannic character of the wood, that starts to form your balance element, your kind of structural element in those beers. So it's desirable from that point of view. But we find that people are we work very hard to make sure that the beers that we brew have no perceptible astringency, except for when we're doing fruit beers, when sometimes a little bit of a tannin is one of those cues that you can use to kind of, because all fruit has some amount of those things. So that you can use that as a tool. But as a general rule, it's harsh, it's lingering. Some of those compounds are actually bitter as well. So in addition to the purely tannic mouthfeel thing, they actually will trigger certain bitter receptors on your tongue and give you actual bitterness, and that may or may not be desirable depending on the situation. So hope that's helpful. Well, one of these days,
when I taste heavily roasted grains, like in a stout, that comes across as astringent to me. And sometimes I confuse that with bitterness, even though the stout might not have a lot of bittering hops. It tastes bitter because of the highly roasted grain. So I'm never sure whether I would call that astringent or bitter.
Pulling stuff apart is the hardest thing as a taster to do, because our brain is constantly like combining. Everything about our sensory system that puts it all together for us. And as a taster, you want it separate. So yeah, and it's hard because the roasting actually does create bitter compounds that are not polyphenols, but it also makes polyphenols that are easy to confuse with bitterness. And of course, some of them do actually have bitterness. But that's another area where water chemistry can make a big difference. That alkaline water chemistry can, leach out a little bit more of those. Although the malt itself is acidic, so it's classically not considered a problem. But that's another area where different types of darker malts, we're going to have more or less of that kind of that astringency. There's a technique that they're using. I don't know if you guys are anybody's doing it. There's a technique called a cold brew method for making dark beers, that you basically, just like you would with coffee, you take all your dark malts, crystal malts and black malts and everything, and crush them up and mix them with room temperature water and let them stand overnight. And then the next day when you brew, you just filter those out and add that liquid either to your mash tun or save it and add it into the boil. And so you're minimizing the heat. The heat of the mash tends to extract more of those polyphenols out. And so doing it at cold temperature it makes a much, much smoother, softer beer. I tasted one of those in Brazil when was that? Last year for the first time, and I was absolutely blown away. It's like, what are you guys doing? How can I do this? So we're doing that with our chocolate beer. Crystal malt tastes different. The dark malts taste different. It was really an eye opener for me. So something to think about if you like a lot of dark beers and you don't like that astringency. You have to use about twice as much dark malt to get the same amount of color and flavor. But malt's cheap, so.
Okay, so with a lot of the, I'll say newer to me, hops, a lot of fruity characteristics. Does it matter as to when you're tasting a beer and, sometimes you get fruit from esters, fruit from the hops, can you differentiate between where the source of that is, or not really, or you don't care?
Esters and any one chemical is the same chemical. Again, fruit has a lot of different chemicals in it. Hops have a lot of different chemicals in it. It's hard to pick out more than a couple, and in fact, that's another thing they've studied. Even expert tasters cannot identify more than 3 things in a sniff, no matter how experienced they are. They may come back to it, try it again, pick out a few more things, but you're going to only be able to get 2 or 3 different kind of flavor aspects out of any given sniff, no matter how good, no matter how experienced you are. Your brain just doesn't have the ability to focus on that many things at a time. Again, you can come back, try it again, try and focus your brain on something else. Think, I'm going to look at the malt, and then I'm going to come back, I'm going to look at the hops, and go back, look at the fruit. You can kind of do that a little bit, but, we're not completely in charge of ourselves, so.
I was kind of blown away. I historically make a citrus wheat beer for the summer, and I usually grate a bunch of orange zest to throw in the beer, and I get great orange flavor.
Yeah.
So I made a pale ale recently, and I used Mandarina Bavarian hops. And I got the same thing just by throwing hops in.
Yeah.
And I swear, why would I do that to the oranges instead of just throwing in some Mandarina Bavaria hops?
Either way is fine. I'll tell you, one of the most memorable beers of my life was brewed by a guy in Cape Town, South Africa, who had been running a Spaten plant or something down there. And he had a pretty good sized brew pub and small production outfit out of town in the wine country. And he made an IPA. He's a German brewer making an IPA with 100% Mandarina Bavaria in it. It was absolutely breathtaking and so orangey and just like really fantastic. So some of those there's a French hop called a Barbe Rouge that has a lot of strawberry character to it. There's all kinds of interesting hops out there. So, they're not all available through homebrew channels, unfortunately, but talk Dan Listerman into using them. He maybe sell you some. I know Dan very, very well. I lived down there for 15 years. I went to UC, and my buddy Ray Spangler started up the Bloatarian Brewing League years ago after I left town. And so we haven't been down. I guess we came down for a short trip this summer. We had a pool party, but hope to get down there more often, as things we get through this COVID craziness. So hope to see you in person, share a beer sometime. I should probably get going and get some dinner.
Okay.
Super awesome talking to you guys.
Thanks again for joining us and taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Really appreciate it. Honored to spend this time and talk with you. It's been great. Thanks again.
Yeah, and we'll definitely be on the lookout for that taste
Yeah, it'll be a year. It'll be like a year and a half or
Well,
2 years maybe. It's going to be a
I
while.
think
But
you know, especially
it's going to be good. There's so much amazing science, but it's taken me a long time to get through it. It's kicking my ass, honestly. But it's going to be good. But I got a Facebook page that I put up. I've been doing a lot of. We're getting ready at Forbidden Root to launch a digestive bitters and a house-made vermouth and a house-made tonic syrup. So if you're into cocktails or any of that kind of stuff, I've been posting a lot of that kind of stuff. And, you know, put some beer stuff and some tasting stuff up there. It's kind of haphazard. I don't have a like set schedule or anything, but there's some interesting stuff up there. So check me out.
Randy, are you okay with us including this video on our YouTube page?
Sure.
Thank you.
Nothing else, anyone?
No.
All right.
Just gonna say thanks for coming.
Oh, sure. My pleasure. Happy brewing.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.